Okay, so today we'll be talking about Chapter 10, Section 1. And we're going to delve into the causes of the American Civil War, the most tragic conflict and the most deadly conflict that we've ever been involved in. And we need to first discuss the divisive politics of slavery. This issue was the number one hot topic, the number one divisive topic that our nation was polarizing about. Northern people generally disliked slavery. Southern people considered it a sacred institution generally. Yet though we've talked about how it was mostly wealthy Southern planters who were able to afford slaves. But their voice did carry the loudest because they were often the ones influencing politics and government at that time.
The struggle over slavery began in the early 1800s, when the southern slave states and the northern free states developed very different economies and cultures. The North created an industrial economy, while the South depended on agriculture. The growth of the textile industry in the North and in Europe led to an increased demand for cotton. Slavery became even more important to Southerners who needed the cheap labor to grow and harvest more cotton. To them, slaves were an essential part of the economy. Some Northerners felt slavery was immoral. Slave owners had complete control over the lives of enslaved African Americans. Over time, the question of the spread of slavery to the territories of the United States became an issue of growing importance. It first arose in 1819, when Missouri, where slavery was legal, asked to be admitted as a new state. Henry Clay of Kentucky persuaded Congress to pass the Missouri Compromise, which banned slavery from territories north of Missouri's southern border. It also allowed Missouri to enter the Union as a slave state and Maine to enter as a free state. This kept the number of free and slave states the same, so the two regions, the North and the South, would have the same number of senators. Meanwhile, reformers called abolitionists began to push for the end of slavery. In 1831, abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison began publishing a newspaper called The Liberator. Frederick Douglass also began an anti-slavery newspaper. Douglass was a former slave who had escaped to the North. He gave many speeches describing the cruelty of slavery to win support for the anti-slavery movement. Some abolitionists took more direct action. They formed a network called the Underground Railroad to help enslaved African Americans escape from the South and reach free states in the North or Canada. Thomas Garrett of Delaware was one of the most active people in this network. He helped nearly 3,000 of the enslaved escape to freedom. But white abolitionists were not the only people working on the Underground Railroad. Harriet Tubman, who had herself escaped slavery, made many trips to the South to help other enslaved African Americans escape. Slavery became a more pressing issue during the Mexican War, when Congressman David Wilmot proposed banning slavery from any land obtained from Mexico. In 1850, California applied to enter the Union as a free state. This raised a problem because admitting it would cause an imbalance of free and slave states in the Senate. In response, Congress passed the Compromise of 1850. It allowed California's entry as a free state, but dictated that other territories acquired from Mexico could choose on their own whether to be free or slave states. This option to choose was known as popular sovereignty. The Compromise of 1850 included another law, the Fugitive Slave Act. This act required both Northerners and Southerners to help recapture escaped enslaved African Americans. Many Northerners refused to obey this law. Anger over the law and over slavery spurred abolitionist Harriet Beecher Stowe to write an important book, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Her novel told of the brutality of slavery, symbolized by the fate of the slave Uncle Tom. A kindly and Christian man, Tom was beaten to death by the overseer hired by his master. The book, which clearly illustrated the injustices of slavery, became a bestseller in the North. Prior to its publication, many Northerners were indifferent about slavery. After reading the book, many people became outraged over slavery. To Southerners, though, Uncle Tom's Cabin was false and an attack on their way of life. The next step in the growing fight over slavery came in 1854, when Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This act organized the new Nebraska and Kansas territories and gave the residents in both areas the right to decide whether or not to allow slavery. Both pro- and anti-slavery settlers flooded into Kansas, hoping to have enough voters to determine the area's laws on slavery. By 1856, Kansas had two governments, one pro-slavery and one anti-slavery. Members of the two sides fought each other, and people began to call the area Bleeding Kansas. In the wake of this violence, the new Republican Party was formed. The Republicans were against the spread of slavery into the Western territories. In the 1856 election, the Republicans ran John C. Fremont for president. Though Fremont lost to Democrat James Buchanan, Republican views on slavery began to gain wider acceptance in the North. In 1857, the Supreme Court decided the important case of Dred Scott versus Sanford. The court ruled that Congress had no power to ban slavery from territories. The decision was celebrated in the South, but viewed angrily in the North. In 1858, Stephen Douglas, the proponent of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, was challenged by Republican Abraham Lincoln in the race for Senator of Illinois. During their debates, Lincoln firmly declared the Republican goal of blocking the spread of slavery. Lincoln did not win the election, but his name became known to many Americans. Tensions between the sides grew in 1859, when a white abolitionist named John Brown tried to spark a slave revolt in Virginia. After Brown was captured, he was tried in Virginia for treason. He was executed and became a martyr in the eyes of his anti-slavery supporters. Those views angered many in the South, who had always feared a slave revolt. As the presidential election of 1860 approached, Republicans chose Abraham Lincoln as their candidate. Southerners threatened that if a Republican won the election, their states would secede or leave the Union. The Democratic Party split in two over the slavery issue. Northern Democrats named one nominee, and Southern Democrats picked another. By winning enough support in the North, Lincoln won the election. Many Southerners feared that Lincoln and his Republican supporters would move not just to ban slavery from the territories, but to end it in the South. As a result, people in South Carolina voted to secede from the Union on December 20th, 1860. 6 more states quickly followed. These states joined to form the Confederate States of America. The Confederacy created its own constitution, which guaranteed the protection of slavery. 4 more states would eventually leave the Union and join the Confederacy. Soon after, the North and South were plunged into a long and bitter civil war.
And so that clip served as an excellent preview for this chapter. We're going to be talking about over the next 4 days how only 83 years after our country's beginning, it fell apart. And as I've told you many times throughout this course, it's more common for countries to fall apart than it is for them to stay together. And yet, through such a terrible conflict, Abraham Lincoln did manage to preserve the Union, but at great cost. But in this chapter, we're going to be learning about what led us to that disunion, what led us to that tragedy. And of course, we've talked about sectionalism a lot in this course, how people began to think of themselves as Northerners or think of themselves as Southerners. And the North began to vote one way in elections, and the South was voting a different way. And some of the reasons for this that we've already explored. For example, by the 1850s, the North was largely industrialized. Most manufactured products were coming out of the northern United States. Most of the railroads in the country were in the northern part of the United States, carrying raw materials to the east. Manufacturers and settlers were also going west, but focusing their investment in the northern part of the country. Urbanization was already happening, meaning that cities were growing in size and population. Industry was growing. Investment, GDP were growing in the north. Communication and infrastructure were growing. For example, telegraph wires were spreading all across the Northeast. Immigrants were coming in to the north in large numbers because that's where the job opportunities were. Not many people were coming into the South. largely because it would be difficult for new immigrants to compete with slave labor. And so the South's population remained somewhat stagnant while the North's population was growing exponentially. And let's contrast with the South. This is known as the Antebellum period in Southern American history. The South was predominantly rural. Most people living in the South were farmers. Most people lived on either large plantations, if they were very wealthy, or rural farms, like most. The Southern economy relied almost entirely on cash crops. Agricultural commodities were the number one traded item in Southern markets. There were very few immigrants coming into the South at that time because generally immigrants were coming to the North because that's where the job opportunities were. Again, it would be difficult to compete with slave labor. There were 3 states in particular, and if memory serves, it's Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana, where slaves actually outnumbered whites. And we talked about what happened in Jamaica when slaves outnumbered whites. The slaves overtook and declared their independence. We talked about the same in Haiti, where the slaves rose up and declared their independence. We talked about the same on various ships, and this has happened throughout. So in these 3 states in particular, the whites who were in power there considered slavery important to their way of life and feared the freedom of blacks within their states. And so since Southern states feared an end to slavery because they saw it as an end to their very way of life, Southern states voted together, to the point where in every major political decision involving slavery, every Southern state had the same vote, every Northern state had a different vote. And so, since compromise could not be reached between the North and the South in regards to slavery, the 2 parties could not agree on what to be done, each group sought to increase their influence and power. The Southerners began to think, how can we increase our influence and power in the legislature? And the North did as well. And the Mexican War proved to be yet another divisive point leading up to the Civil War. Now, Congress passed the Wilmot Proviso, mandating that no territory acquired from the war with Mexico could have slavery. Now, for the North, if these territories did allow slavery, Northerners were concerned that would create more slave states. Number one, this would prohibit work opportunities for people moving into this area. But number 2, it would also limit their power in the legislature. Now, for the South, Southerners viewed slaves as property. And the Constitution protects a person's personal property rights. And so Southerners feared that more slave states would be a restriction on this personal property. And we'll talk about that. In fact, the Supreme Court confirmed at that time that a slave was property and not a person under the Constitution. Now, in 1855, California had reached a sufficient enough population. Remember, we talked about the gold rush and how people just swarmed into California. And so by 1850, there were enough people there for them to apply for statehood. California wanted to be a free state. And the president supported the admission of California as a free state. And Zachary Taylor, president at the time, recommended, who was a Whig, by the way, recommended to the South that slavery be decided by each territory. That was a decision known as popular sovereignty, that slavery could be decided by each territory. Now, as the Senate debated what should be done about slavery, every time it was brought up about a possible end to slavery, Southerners would threaten secession. Secession is a formal withdrawal from a country. A formal withdrawal from the Union. And we've seen Henry Clay several times trying to settle disputes about slavery. Henry Clay offered, who was the Speaker of the House, by the way, offered a compromise called the Compromise of 1850. You see, California wanted to be a free state. Zachary Taylor supported California's decision. He said, perhaps we could avoid war if each territory decides for themselves whether they want to be slave or free. And then the South has no one to secede against, because they can only be mad at California if California decides they don't want slaves there. And so Henry Clay offered the Compromise of 1850, and we're going to explore that in the next couple of slides. It was meant to settle the dispute over slavery because Southern states were threatening to leave the Union if California became a free state. Very similar to how many Northerners felt when Missouri wanted to be a slave state. Now, the compromise itself was meant to appease both leaders in the North as well as in the South. California was to be admitted as a free state. This would satisfy Northerners, giving Northern states more influence in the legislature. However, what Southerners feared most was an end to their way of life, an end to the institution of slavery. And so for California to be admitted as a slave state, the Fugitive Slave Law was passed. The Fugitive Slave Act was a more effective slave law. We'll explore it in more detail in just a moment. Meanwhile, the government was to purchase the territory of New Mexico from the new state of Texas. You see, when Texas rebelled against Mexico, and when New Mexico was conquered in the U.S. war with Mexico in 1846, Texas laid claim to the territory of New Mexico. And so one of the provisions here is that New Mexico would become a new state. Another part of the compromise, the slave trade would be banned in Washington, D.C., but that slavery would continue to be permitted. But at this time, it was already becoming very clear that we were on the brink of war. At every turn, the Southerners were threatening secession. At every turn, the Southerners were trying to claim that Northerners were trying to put an end to their way of life. And there was a lot of mutual distrust and a lot of mutual animosity.
After Zachary Taylor died in July of 1850, it became the responsibility of the new president, Millard Fillmore, to make sure the issue of slavery on the newly acquired lands of the Southwest did not tear the nation apart. This task was actually accomplished thanks mostly to the efforts of Congressman Henry Clay of Kentucky. He helped put together 5 laws that, when taken together, are known as the Compromise of 1850. These laws were designed to appeal to both sides of the slavery issue, those who wanted to stop its spread into the new American territories, and those who wanted slavery to grow. The people who were against slavery were pleased with the part of the compromise that allowed California to enter the Union as a free state, and also with the law that banned the slave trade in Washington, D.C. And the people who were for slavery liked the part of the compromise that allowed people living in the new U.S. territories of Utah and New Mexico to decide for themselves if they wanted slavery. And the pro-slavery people were very happy with the fugitive slave law part of the compromise, because it forced people in the free states to return escaped slaves to their owners in the South. After he signed the laws of the Compromise of 1850, Millard Fillmore served for a little less than 2 more years as president. And he was not selected to be the Whig candidate in the election of 1852, which saw Franklin Pierce, a Democrat, elected as America's 14th president.
Now, the next major debate that we're going to be looking at, we've already discussed the Hayne-Webster debate. Now we need to talk about John C. Calhoun versus the same Daniel Webster. And if you remember the previous debate, it was a discussion at dinner how Daniel Webster said, "Our Union, it must be preserved." And then, of course, John C. Calhoun stood up at that very same dinner and said, "Our Union next to our liberty most dear." And that was an extreme difference. You know, Webster arguing for the strong central government, the unity of a great nation. And then Calhoun arguing for states' rights, that a state should have the right to nullify a law it disagrees with or considers unconstitutional. That same debate is going to carry over to the Senate floor. It became one of the greatest debates in American history. And many people still carry on this same discussion. You see, John C. Calhoun laid out the Southern case for slavery in the territories. In his view, slaves were property. In his point of view, if slaves were property and the Constitution protects personal property rights, then if slavery were outlawed, then that would be a violation of the Constitution, rendering the government null and void, giving Southern states the right to secede. So this was the legal argument for secession that Calhoun was laying out. And by contrast, we have Daniel Webster, once again, pleading the case for national unity. And so the Calhoun-Webster debate in the Senate is really a continuation of that same Hayne-Webster debate at a dinner. But if you think about an angry argument at a dinner, and now it's being held on the Senate floor. The compromise was eventually adopted. Henry Clay wound up leaving Washington. He retired from politics when the Senate rejected his compromise. He said, I'm done. I'm done trying to make peace. He's been trying to make peace now for 30 years. And he was over it when his final compromise of 1850 was initially rejected. Now, eventually, Stephen Douglas, who we're going to be talking about a lot as well, who's also going to be involved in one of the famous debates in American history, reintroduces the resolutions in a way, individually, that gets them passed. The new president, Millard Fillmore, gave support. The South eventually agreed to negotiate, and the compromise came into law 9 years after it was introduced. Voted into law in 1859. By the way, secession would occur the next year. So what was meant to preserve the Union, well, it only worked for a few months. So I want you to understand there are two sides to every story. That Southerners viewed Northerners as John Browns. Southerners used a lot of propaganda like this. Of course, we know about John Brown from your essay. He took matters into his own hands. He wanted to free the slaves violently. He not only went into a town in Kansas and started killing slave owners, true story, we'll talk about that soon, but he also went to a weapons compound in Virginia and tried to hand out weapons to slaves. And he was everything that Southerners feared. They called him a terrorist, though we also saw from your document analyzer how Henry David Thoreau of Walden, the Transcendentalist, called him a hero, and how Northern newspapers called him a hero. But this is how Southerners viewed Northerners. But this is what Northerners thought of Southerners. And so really we have a lot of propaganda going on in this divisive time in American history. Southerners were perceived as violent slave owners beating Uncle Tom. You see, a young lady named Harriet Beecher Stowe was 14 when she wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. It's amazing, right? What did I do by 14? Not that much. I drove a tractor. Okay, you know. What have we done by 14? Well, we certainly haven't wrote a book that changed the world, but hey, we still got time. I wanted to explore Uncle Tom with you just a little bit. You see, Uncle Tom's Cabin, while, you know, the language is archaic, you know, you would find it offensive with some of the racial slurs within the book, and it's not quite culturally appropriate. But for the time, it was powerful, because what it did was humanize a political situation. You see, it's one thing to hear about the evil institution of slavery. It's one thing to hear about the plight of 4 million people. It's quite another to hear someone's story. It's quite another case to take a political issue and make it personal. You see, it's one thing to talk about slavery. It's another to see the scars on a person's back. I don't know if you noticed the famous photograph of the man with the scars from being beaten. We'll look at that again later. Again, it's one thing to talk about 4 million. It's another to talk about an individual and to become connected with their story. And so that's what Uncle Tom did so well. And lastly, I want to look at John Brown with you. And I'm going to close with some of these famous images here. You see, Northerners perceived him as a hero. Southerners wanted to portray him as evil. And it's really a matter of perspective. Through what lens do you want to view this person? Today we'll be talking about Chapter 10, Section 2. And the title of this is Protest, Resistance, and Violence. We're going to be talking about, again, the politics of slavery, but it's more than just a political disagreement. People began killing one another over this issue even prior to the American Civil War. And so we're going to talk about some of these instances of violence leading up to the American Civil War. First off, I wanted to show you a map of the Underground Railroad. Now, I don't know if you're like me. When I was a kid, I thought this was an actual railroad. I went to Disney World looking for an exhibit of the Underground Railroad. I remember going to the Tom Sawyer. I know they don't have this exhibit anymore, but they used to have a Huck Finn exhibit. It was really cool, like a big giant treehouse, and there was a pretend Underground Railroad. And I thought, oh, cool, there's going to be a neat tunnel. And nope, it's just a network of people. I'm like, what? You know, well, anyway, I was a little disappointed as a kid. But I think it's fascinating as an adult how there was this secret network of people providing safe houses for escaping slaves. There were people in the South as well as in the North helping others escape from slavery. And so they were helping one another to escape. The Compromise of 1850 mandated that Northern states were required by federal law to turn in escaped slaves. This was known as the Fugitive Slave Act. This was the part of the Compromise of 1850 that eventually helped the South to give in to the idea of California being a free state. But it had very harsh terms. Any alleged fugitive. Now that's the trick there, any alleged fugitive. Well, how do you determine if someone is an alleged fugitive? Simply by the color of their skin. So really any black person could be accused of being an escaped slave. These alleged fugitives were denied a trial by jury. They were denied the right to testify on their own behalf. I don't know if you've seen the movie 12 Years a Slave. Solomon Northrop, true story, was kidnapped. He was not an escaped slave. He was kidnapped, and he was sold into slavery. And the Fugitive Slave Act made this possible. He was not allowed to testify on his own behalf. In fact, the judge received more money for selling him into slavery than he would have received if he had ruled in Solomon Northrop's favor. People could be convicted of helping escaped fugitives. And so that made members of the Underground Railroad criminals. Can you imagine? You know, this takes civil disobedience to a whole new level. Harriet Tubman, that we now celebrate as a hero, was a wanted fugitive. There was a price on her head in the South, and she would have been convicted as a criminal under United States law under the Fugitive Slave Act. Now, as you can imagine, a number of people were upset about this law. A number of people openly defied this law. In fact, some states began to pass personal liberty laws, openly defying this law. Some Northerners within the Underground Railroad began to help slaves escape to Canada.
Some of the abolitionists established what was called the Underground Railroad. It was not underground, nor was it a railroad. It consisted of groups of people who worked together to secretly escort Southern slaves from the South to freedom in the North. Harriet Tubman, an escaped slave, was a guide or conductor on the Underground Railroad. During the 1850s, she made 19 trips from the South to the North, leading more than 300 people to freedom. One abolitionist, John Brown, had a plan to give guns to slaves so they could fight for their freedom. He and a small group of followers seized a weapons storehouse in Harper's Ferry, Virginia. His plan failed when local militia and federal troops stopped them. Some slaves, such as Nat Turner, started uprisings on their own, but these also failed. The Civil War had many causes. There were the economic issues of tariffs and Northern control of railroads and banks. Political issues of states' rights and who controlled the Congress, and the heated issue of slavery. As the presidential election of 1860 approached, Southerners feared losing control to a Northerner.
I wanted to give you a little information about Harriet Tubman. She herself had escaped from slavery, but not before being injured. Her owner hit her upside the head with a lead weight, causing traumatic brain damage. In fact, this caused her to pass out several times during the day. She never fully recovered from those injuries she sustained from her owner. Yet, despite her disability, she made multiple trips down to the South to help others escape. And she once said, "I freed 1,000 slaves. I could have freed 1,000 more if only they knew they were slaves." Because you see, one of the troubles that she had was actually convincing others to escape, because escaping was a life-threatening and sometimes fatal undertaking. You see, the Underground Railroad was a secret network of people helping slaves to escape. And despite this network, sometimes slaves were caught, and they suffered violent fates. These fugitives would usually go away from their plantations at night. They would often have to go with what they had and what they could carry, and there would often be posses sent out to look for them. As I said, if they were caught They could be killed on sight, or in some cases they were brought back to their plantations. I've read of horrible fates that befell these slaves. In some cases they were kneecapped, meaning they would have their legs broken. In some cases they would be hung in front of the rest of the slaves. I even read of a case where slaves were burned at the stake to make an example of. A young 14-year-old girl wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, Harriet Beecher Stowe. I've already told you about the book a little. The main theme of this book was that it showed slavery to be a moral and personal issue, that it made it real for many. Even abolitionists in the North, who were already convinced that slavery was wrong, saw it for the first time as an issue affecting people personally. Sometimes you have to see a thing for yourself before you can really understand it. And sometimes, as they say, it ain't real till it's real. Well, that's what Uncle Tom's Cabin did for many Americans, was it made the issue of slavery real. A little about Harriet Beecher Stowe. She went on to meet Abraham Lincoln before his assassination. And this is what Lincoln said to her. So, you're the little lady who wrote this book that started the big war. Can you imagine having such a profound impact? John Brown, with his desperate actions. Harriet Tubman, with her heroism. Frederick Douglass, with his peaceful political attempts, and William Lloyd Garrison. All of these individuals have been working throughout their careers to either end slavery or to start the war that would end slavery. Yet it was a 14-year-old girl who got people thinking with a story. It's powerful what an impact a story can have.
Perhaps the single most important cause of the American Civil War was the issue of slavery. The North and South held opposing views on slavery. Many in the free northern states wanted to contain slavery and prevent any new states from becoming slave states. But Southerners felt it was their constitutional right to own slaves. The Southern economy depended on slave labor to grow cotton, which it sold to textile mills in Britain and in the North. The cotton gin had led to the spread of cotton growing in the South and to the spread of slavery. Some Americans, the abolitionists, argued loudly that slavery should be ended. They made speeches and wrote articles and books saying that slavery was immoral. They denounced the Fugitive Slave Act, which allowed officials to arrest any African American suspected of being a runaway slave. The writer Harriet Beecher Stowe was the daughter of an abolitionist minister in Cincinnati, Ohio. Stowe lived along the Ohio River, a border between slavery in Kentucky and freedom in Ohio. She often visited plantations in Kentucky, and she grew deeply troubled by the miserable conditions in which slaves lived and the injustice of slavery itself. She witnessed the back-breaking labor of the slaves as well as the brutal way their owners treated them. Spurred to action, Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, a novel about a runaway slave who is eventually captured and sold back into slavery. Stowe depicted the cruelty of slave owners and the humanity of slaves. Many readers were stunned by the book's graphic descriptions of the harsh treatment of slaves. The book became an instant bestseller and highlighted the issue as a moral question of right versus wrong. Before Uncle Tom's Cabin was published, many Northerners had been unconcerned about slavery. But now many people viewed Stowe's book as evidence of slavery's immorality. Southerners called the book propaganda, claiming it did not describe slavery and slave owners fairly. They grew more suspicious of the North because they felt their rights and their way of life were under attack. Southerners wondered how their economy could survive without slaves, and why Northerners wanted to take away their rights. The tension between the two sections continued to grow, fed by fighting between pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces in Kansas. The nation, it seemed, was heading toward war. In 1861, after the election of Abraham Lincoln, that war finally broke out. Several southern states left the Union to create their own nation, and North and South formed armies that fought each other. Harriet Beecher Stowe's powerful book had played a part in readying people in the North for that war.
Now, as I've told you many times, people were working desperately to solve the crisis, to reunite our country, to end slavery by peaceful means. Perhaps one of the more clever ideas, aside from outlawing slavery altogether, was that of Stephen Douglas. Douglas believed that territories would naturally be incorporated into the Unionist states as the population of the Western territories expanded. Which he was right, obviously. We now have 50 states, many of them in the West. He wanted a railroad going west from Chicago. It would eventually connect the two oceans. Again, that would be achieved in the 1870s, the Transcontinental Railroad. He believed that westward expansion would actually help the Democratic Party because the Democrats tend to represent rural farmers at this time. They tend to be popular among the poor. And so as farmers moved westward, that would grow the Democratic Party. And so he felt that Southerners who were exclusively Democrats at this time would acquiesce to the idea of westward expansion. Now, he felt that popular sovereignty would be the best way to organize the new states. California, after all, decided to be a free state. It was their choice, supported by President Zachary Taylor. And Douglas believed that popular sovereignty was impractical in Western farms. He believed that slavery would grow obsolete because, with mechanization of farming, machines would replace many farm hands, both in the North and the South. But he also believed that the climate of the West was not conducive to cash crops like tobacco, particularly cotton, sugar, or rice. And so, like the North, our country would eventually outlaw slavery. Douglas's plan was not just theoretical. He hoped to put it into practice. He believed that popular sovereignty would eventually fix the issue of slavery. Meanwhile, the Missouri Compromise had outlawed slavery north of the Mason-Dixon line, also known as the 3630 parallel. It's a line of longitude here. You see the old division between the North and the South. That's called the Mason-Dixon line. That was defined by the Missouri Compromise. Now, Douglas hoped to revise that old compromise from 1820. Because after all, he wanted territories to be able to vote on the issue of slavery within their own respective territory. It's a great idea in theory. However, Abraham Lincoln is going to vehemently disagree with Douglas's ideas for reasons that I do applaud him for, that we'll look at in just a moment. But nonetheless, the Kansas-Nebraska Act was going to allow popular sovereignty on the issue of slavery in the territories. Now, when popular sovereignty is going to be the deciding factor on an issue such as slavery, it's going to be a difficult one. See, voting fraud was not uncommon at this time. And the vote over slavery in Kansas is one of the greatest instances of voter fraud in American history. John Brown is going to come into play as a major character that we'll see in just a moment.
Emotions on both sides of the slavery issue once again rose in 1854 when a bill called the Kansas-Nebraska Act passed Congress. This bill repealed the Missouri Compromise and allowed residents of Kansas and Nebraska to decide for themselves whether or not slavery would be allowed in their states. The result of this unfortunate law was that settlers who strongly favored slavery and settlers who hated slavery both immigrated to Kansas. When these groups came into contact with each other, much fighting and killing resulted. Kansas was often referred to as Bleeding Kansas.
So, Bleeding Kansas. The vote over the issue of slavery in the Kansas-Nebraska territories turned into violence. It is a wonderful thing in this country that we have peaceful transitions of power. In fact, until the creation of the United States, that was a rather rare occurrence. Typically, transitions of power resulted in what we saw in Libya during the Arab Spring in 2012, where Omar Gaddafi was stabbed to death by an angry mob. That's the more common occurrence of transitions of power, at least up until the creation of the United States. Votes don't often go down so well, as was the case in 1854 in the Kansas-Nebraska territories. Settlers poured into Kansas, poured into Nebraska, simply to vote, and then they would leave. Voting records show that dead people were voting in this election. I'm not saying zombies rose from the grave. I'm saying that people reported their names as the names of the deceased so that they could vote multiple times. There were instances of people wearing fake beards and disguises and then going to vote multiple times and then taking the disguise off and voting again. Every instance of voter fraud you can think of occurred during this vote on the issue of slavery in the Kansas-Nebraska territories. In fact, more people voted for slavery in the Kansas-Nebraska territory than the population of the Kansas-Nebraska territory. That means more people voted than would be humanly possible. Again, the most fraudulent election in history, at least in the history of our country. Now, this vote went down very badly. In fact, the anti-slavery group refused to recognize the results of the election. I don't blame them, right? It was obviously a fake. And so they set up an anti-slavery capital of Kansas at Topeka, which is currently the capital of Kansas. And then a pro-slavery government was set up at Lecompton. And so you have two capitals of one state, and each capital has declared the other null and void. It's kind of like there was a case in history where we had two popes. You ever heard that story? Yeah, we once had two popes, and both popes excommunicated one another. They said, you go to hell. No, you go to hell. We're both going to hell, whatever. We had two popes. It didn't go so well. We had two capitals of one state. Now, the pro-slavery capital sent a mob of 800 people to burn down the capital of the anti-slavery people. That's known as the Sack of Lawrence. So here's a charcoal engraving of the time. This was all over newspapers. Can you imagine? I know you're like, oh, that was whatever, long ago. It's not that exciting. Can you imagine if something like this happened today? If we had a vote, it was clearly a fraud, and then people, imagine, okay, so we have the presidential election. Let's say that one of the people loses. Let's say one of them loses. Now, let's say that same individual rounds up an angry mob, which I'm concerned about the potential of that happening.
I actually think that might happen.
I am honestly concerned about the potential of that happening. The loser rounds up an angry mob and starts setting towns on fire.
Yeah.
Again, I'm just letting you know these things have happened before. Yeah, so I'm just letting you know it's happened before. In fact, in the case of Kansas, there were 200 deaths after this election. Once again, can you imagine? 2016, the election goes down, 200 people dead after the election. I mean, oh my gosh, right? We'd have Britain coming back to try to send peacekeeping forces over here, saying, okay, we screwed up. We shouldn't have given you your independence. We're taking that back now. So here comes John Brown. John Brown believed that slavery would not end but for violent means. Brown sent his followers to the pro-slavery capital at Potawatomi, Kansas. And he found the first 5 men on the street, and he killed them in cold blood, and he cut their hands off and put them on spears in front of the town. That's the very same man that you're writing about on whether or not he was a terrorist. By the way, before you dismiss him as insane, Harriet Tubman was working with his cause. She was aware of the Harper's Ferry incident prior to its occurrence. She probably would have helped had she could, but her health prevented her from being involved in the Harper's Ferry raid. So I just want to let you know he had some powerful friends. Now, why did Brown do this? Well, like any other violent political action, Brown hoped to start a fight. Well, what better way to start a fight than by going in and killing people and then pinning it on the anti-slavery party, which is exactly what he did. And did he start a fight? Oh, yeah, he started a fight. And, in fact, the fight led to the deaths of 200 people. I mean, Charles Manson would have been proud. Now, I bring up Charles Manson because, again, while, okay, I'm going to go ahead and say Manson was a lunatic, but his purpose was to start a fight. He wanted to start a race war in the 1960s. And so he would kill white women and blame it on black people. And he would kill black people and blame it on the police. I mean, can you imagine if somebody started doing that today? Okay. Now, meanwhile, you might think, well, okay, what's going on in the political front? Maybe they're just talking about these things. Maybe the Frederick Douglasses of the world are going to tell people to chill out. Maybe the Henry Clays are going to make peace. Oh, no. At this point, I mean, we're in the late 1850s. Charles Sumner, senator from the North, went on just one of the most famous political rants in American history. He went on for several days just calling the South a bunch of redneck, hick, slave-owning people. And he went on for days talking about how the South was backward, how we were the laughing stock of the free world, how we would dare to say that all men are created equal, and then go on to enslave others. The audacity, the barbarism of the South for doing such a thing. And then Senator from South Carolina. It's always South Carolina, by the way. Anyway, Senator from South Carolina, Preston Brooks, in the Senate, which you'll get to go there someday. Go on the D.C. trip. You'll get to see it. In the Senate, goes up to Charles Sumner. And he says, and I quote, "Mr. Sumner, your comments are liable to my people and a personal attack upon my family." And then he proceeds to pull out a cane and beat Sumner half to death within the halls of the Senate. This was known as the caning of Charles Sumner. In the Senate, a fight broke out because of slavery. Charles Sumner sustained multiple contusions to the head, upon which he never recovered. In fact, he would later die of a stroke as a result of his injuries.
I don't know if it's still there, but when I went to D.C., when we were...
All right, so today we'll be talking about Chapter 10, Section 3. The title of this is The Birth of the Republican Party. Now, throughout the mid-1850s, the issue of slavery, as well as other factors, split not only our nation, but also the political parties that lead our nation. So this is going to lead to the dissolution of some political parties, but also the creation of one of our two major parties today, and that is the Republican Party. And we're going to talk about how the Republican Party started in the mid-1850s around the issue of slavery. But first we need to talk about a number of other issues. There were several different parties. We were, yes, a two-party system, but there were a number of minor parties that are going to eventually unite around the issue of slavery. And one of these was the Whig Party. Ever since Andrew Jackson in the late 1820s, the Whig Party had formed around the issue of the Bank of the United States. They hoped to preserve the Bank of the United States by stopping Andrew Jackson's destruction of it. And from the 1820s forward, there were a number of Whig presidents, William Henry Harrison, Zachary Taylor, and a number of Whig politicians. So they were entrenched as a kind of formal political party, one of the major two parties at that time. But they split over the issue of slavery. Now, in the 1852 election, because of the division among the Whigs, the Democrat Franklin Pierce became president in 1852. And really, after the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Whig Party split up as well, and that was the attempt to use popular sovereignty to allow people to decide for themselves whether or not a state should be free or slave. And the unfortunate reality of Kansas and Nebraska was that when it came to an issue that important and that divisive, people were not able to do this in a peaceful and democratic way. Another party that we need to know about that became the Republican Party was a group called the Know-Nothings. These were a group of nativists. They believed in giving preferential treatment to native-born Americans as opposed to immigrants coming in. They hoped to stop the flow of immigrants to make it more difficult for people to move to this country, in particular targeting Asian Americans coming to the West Coast, but also many Mexican Americans coming up after the U.S. war with Mexico, but also many European immigrants. And so this Know-Nothing Party formed around this idea of nativism. They were mostly made up of middle-class, white, obviously, Protestants. And the reason, they opposed immigration, especially people they didn't agree with politically. They especially opposed groups who were Catholic. And they saw Catholicism as a threat to their way of life. In fact, this anti-Catholic sentiment endured. When John F. Kennedy became the first Catholic president, believe me, there was a lot of anti-Catholic sentiment. In fact, when the Ku Klux Klan rose to its peak membership in 1925, much of that was around anti-Catholic sentiment. So sometimes we forget that though we like to think of ourselves as tolerant in regards to religion, it's often not the case. And one last point about this group, they called themselves the Know-Nothing Party. They like to think of themselves as a secret society. And they were called the Know-Nothings because of their commitment to secrecy. When people would ask them about their beliefs, they would say they knew nothing. And so, since they wouldn't talk, people just called them the Know-Nothings because that's how they responded to questions. The next party I want to talk about is the Liberty Party. Now, the issue of slavery united all of these different groups together around the Republican Party. The Liberty Party was a group of abolitionists. They hoped to, like Frederick Douglass, pursue an end of slavery through laws. And their vote did sway several different presidential elections, in particular in 1844. The next group is the Free Soilers. You see, all of these people opposed slavery, but for different reasons. The Free Soilers simply opposed the extension of slavery into territories. They just didn't want people bringing slaves with them as they moved west. And they weren't necessarily abolitionists. They didn't care if slavery ended or not. Their concern was over the spread of slavery. You see, they didn't want to have to compete for jobs. They didn't want their people to have to compete with slaves for work. They were concerned about the effect of slavery on wage-based labor. Because if you look at the South, not many people were moving into the South. The South wasn't really industrializing. People couldn't find jobs in factories in the South, and so the South did not develop as quickly. And the Free Soilers, again, were opposed to slavery just purely on economic grounds. Now, the Republican Party formed out of a coalition of Whigs who had divided over the Kansas-Nebraska Act, a number of Northern Democrats who had grown to dislike slavery, as well as Free Soilers who maybe didn't oppose slavery on moral grounds, but opposed the extension of slavery. And then finally, the Know-Nothings, who just opposed immigration. Now, this is a very diverse group. We call this a coalition, meaning just because you're a Republican doesn't mean you have the same beliefs necessarily as another Republican. But that party may represent enough of your beliefs to get your support. And it may be the same with the Democrats. Horace Greeley is one of the famous founders of the Republican Party. He was an abolitionist. He hoped, like the Liberty Party, to end slavery by the passage of laws. And so the Republican Party formed, and the major party platform, meaning their number one belief, would be the opposition of slavery and the opposition of the extension of slavery. And so you can imagine when Abraham Lincoln became the first Republican president, how southern states are going to feel about this. Now, the first election where we see Republicans running is 1856. The Republican Party selected the war hero John C. Fremont. He was the very same general who marched into California and declared California an American territory. It would become the Republic of California and then obviously the state of California in 1859. And so they hoped this war hero would bring enough of his fame from his military career. Not only had he led troops into California, he was also a guide along the Oregon Trail. And so he is very famous for his prowess. Now, though Fremont lost the election in 1856, this election showed that the Republicans were to be taken seriously because they did come in a close second. Now, the Democrat James Buchanan won this election in 1856. In fact, had Fremont won in 1856, he might have been the Abraham Lincoln to lead us through the American Civil War, because the South was threatening secession if a Republican president were elected. And obviously when Lincoln was elected, they carried through with their promise. But Buchanan won. And perhaps the only good thing about Buchanan was that he was enough of a baby kisser and a fence rider. He was enough of a compromiser, though maybe he didn't stand for much. But he would not criticize slavery. He would not condemn it like the Republican Party was. And so the South was willing to accept Buchanan as their president. In fact, some consider him one of the worst presidents we've ever had. But perhaps the only thing he was famous for was being able to not upset the southern states. In fact, the South finally did secede while he was still president. After the November election where Lincoln did win, the South immediately announced their secession. And Buchanan, still president, though a lame duck president by this time, still president for a couple months, said, and I quote, "Secession is illegal, but it is illegal for me to do anything about it. And so he refused to do anything as southern states were seceding. But of course, when Lincoln would be sworn in February of 1861, he would do something about it for sure. Okay, so today we'll be talking about Chapter 10, Section 4, and the title of this is Slavery and Secession. We're going to be talking about a series of controversial events that heightened the sectional conflict, meaning division, that eventually brought the nation to the brink of war. And so we'll end today with the formal secession or disunion of our country. The first case we need to look at is the famous Dred Scott decision. Now, Dred Scott was a slave. He had lived in the free territory in the North for many years. And when his owner died, you see, he had resided in a free territory with his owner. Originally, they were from Missouri, where it was legal to purchase a slave because of the Missouri Compromise. However, when they had moved to this free territory, though they had not organized as a state yet, there was a bit of confusion. Because should slavery be allowed in these territories? Is it illegal? Well, that had not been tried yet. And so now we have an issue where a slave from Missouri had moved to a free territory with his owner. His owner died while he was in that free territory. And Dred Scott used that case to sue for freedom. And because it is a constitutional issue, it went to the United States Supreme Court. Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Roger Taney, handed down the majority decision in this case. And this case was extremely important to understand because the U.S. Supreme Court, prior to the American Civil War, ruled, and I quote, "Slaves do not have the rights of citizens." And since the claim for freedom was made in a slave state, you see, after the owner died, they had moved back to Missouri. Dred Scott had no ground to stand on. The Dred Scott decision set the precedent that Congress could not forbid slavery in the territories. And so that's the essence of the Dred Scott case. In fact, the Supreme Court decided that Dred Scott would have to be sold back into slavery since he was property and not a person in the eyes of the law, and the proceeds from that sale would be divided up with the rest of the man's estate. Can you imagine, in the U.S. Supreme Court, the court decided that Dred Scott was not a human, that he was not a person, and that was the law of the land when this case was handed down in 1857. I just want you to think about that because in a moment we're going to be talking about John Brown and what he did. And we're going to be thinking about, finally, was he a terrorist or not? But that was the culture and climate of our country when John Brown did what he did.
In 1857, while the reformers worked to improve American society, James Buchanan, a Democrat from Pennsylvania, took the oath of office as America's 15th president. Only 2 days after President Buchanan was inaugurated, Supreme Court Chief Justice Roger Taney issued a series of rulings called the Dred Scott decision that would come to have a tremendous impact on the future of the United States. Dred Scott was a slave from Missouri. He had filed a lawsuit asking the court to grant him his freedom on the grounds that many years earlier his owner had taken him to live for an extended period in a territory where slavery was illegal under the Missouri Compromise. This was the 1820 law, repealed in 1854, that had permitted slavery in Missouri as long as it was outlawed in territories north of what was called the Missouri Compromise line. When they issued the Dred Scott decision, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the Missouri Compromise had been unconstitutional because it had illegally deprived slave owners of their right to own a certain kind of property, that is, their slaves, in the Northern Territories. In other words, the court said that Dred Scott had based his case on an unconstitutional law, and thus it had no merit. In addition, the Supreme Court went on to repeal laws that restricted the rights of American citizens to own slaves in the new U.S. territories, such as Kansas and Nebraska. Furthermore, the court ruled that blacks, even if they weren't slaves, were not allowed to be U.S. citizens. Therefore, they said, Dred Scott should never have been allowed to file a lawsuit in the first place. President Buchanan supported the decision in the Dred Scott case, and it was hailed as a great victory for the pro-slavery forces of the South. But Northerners reacted to it angrily, calling it a wicked and false judgment. And the Republican Party said that the Dred Scott decision clearly showed that slave owners were plotting to use the Constitution to achieve their goal of expanding slavery in the United States.
The next case we need to understand is the Lee-Compton Constitution. The last time we discussed Kansas, we talked about how two governments in Kansas had formed. One outlawing slavery, one permitting slavery. Now, the pro-slavery Kansas government set themselves up in the town of Lee-Compton. They wrote a state charter or constitution seeking statehood, allowing slavery. Kansas requested formal admission into the Union as a slave state. Though a general vote in the territory of Kansas rejected this constitution, meaning the voters of the state of Kansas did not want slavery permitted in their territory. Yet Lee-Compton sent the Constitution to President Buchanan anyway. And the President endorsed the Constitution, even though it went against the will of the voters in the state of Kansas. So that means President Buchanan violated the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which mandated popular sovereignty in the territories. So Buchanan here, again, as I said, is one of the worst presidents we've ever had. Perhaps the only thing he was good at was placating the South, which this is a great example of doing that. Now, meanwhile, Stephen Douglas got a second referendum together. Again, a second vote in Kansas. He said maybe the first one didn't work. Maybe that one was fraudulent. Let's vote again to make sure that Kansas does or does not want slavery. And again, the voters said, no, we don't want slavery. Clearly. Even though President Buchanan endorsed this. Meanwhile, one of the most famous debates in our country's history, the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates. In 1858, Republican Abraham Lincoln was running for Stephen Douglas's Senate seat. Lincoln was rather unknown at this time in politics. And so, just like our presidential debates, a debate is an excellent opportunity for a politician to get a wide audience. And so he challenged Douglas to a series of 7 debates throughout this election cycle. And these are known as the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates. And these debates get to the heart of the issue of slavery. You see, Douglas's position was that there was no need for a civil war. Here we are, 2 years prior to the Civil War. He said, it doesn't have to happen. He's like, listen to me. 500,000 people don't have to die. All we have to do is tolerate the institution of slavery for a few more decades. He said, look, it's backward. It will become obsolete. We don't need to worry about the morality of it. It's just backward. Let's not talk about right or wrong. That was Douglas's position. Lincoln, meanwhile. Abraham Lincoln, soon to become 16th president, some revere him as the greatest president that we've ever had, said, and I quote, "Slavery is a vast moral evil." And so his position was that we would need laws to end the practice of slavery in our country. And as senator, he would work to put these laws into place. Douglas, meanwhile, believed that popular sovereignty would eventually undo slavery. He said, this is a matter we can leave to the voters, that people will eventually decide that slavery is no longer needed, that mechanization of farming will replace the need for large labor forces on plantations, which arguably it has. He said it might take decades, which it did, but which really you could argue that didn't happen until the 20th century. So Stephen Douglas was saying, look, we can wait till the 1900s. If that's what it takes to prevent a civil war, I can put up with slavery. I don't know about you, but it doesn't affect me. That's what Stephen Douglas was saying. He's like, look, we don't have to worry about it. Let's just put it off. Lincoln, however, was like, this is evil. Slavery is evil. And that's not a matter up for debate. And that's not something that we need to vote on. It just is.
In 1858, the year after the Dred Scott decision was issued, Minnesota entered the Union as a free state. Gold was discovered in Colorado, and the Butterfield Overland Stage Line began to operate a regular stagecoach service between Missouri and California, and the journey took 3 weeks. 1858 was also the year of the Lincoln-Douglas debates over slavery that took place during the race for the U.S. Senate in Illinois. On one side was the Democratic candidate for senator, Stephen Douglas. On the opposing side was Abraham Lincoln, the Republican senatorial candidate. Lincoln was opposed to slavery on the grounds that it was a great moral evil. Lincoln tried to convince voters that Stephen Douglas was not to be trusted because he was the man behind the Kansas-Nebraska Act that had made slavery possible in territories where it had been previously illegal. Douglas believed that American citizens should be free to decide if they wanted to have slavery without having government interference. He warned that Lincoln's ideas on racial equality were dangerous and misguided. In the end, Lincoln's moral stand against slavery brought him to the attention of the entire nation, but even at that, Douglas won the race for senator. And the next year, 1859, another free state, Oregon, was admitted to the Union as America's 33rd state.
Now, during this debate, number one, we have to understand that Stephen Douglas actually won the Senate seat, but that this debate became a part of the national discussion. And while Lincoln's stance on slavery was clear, in fact, he made it very clear in this debate, to the point that when Lincoln became president, Southerners saw his election as a threat to their way of life. Now, Lincoln's question in this debate was, how do we form free states if territories were required to allow slavery? How do we have, quote, free states and, quote, slave states if, according to Douglas's position, it were a matter of popular sovereignty? Now, Douglas's response to this question is known as the Freeport Doctrine, that if we just elect leaders that don't enforce slave codes, slavery will eventually end by custom. Now, meanwhile, Douglas did win the Senate seat. Most people in the state that he was running for seemed to be willing to tolerate the institution of slavery, as was evidenced by this election. But the Freeport Doctrine worsened the split between Democrats. You see, Northern Democrats and Southern Democrats don't see eye to eye at all. In fact, this division within the Democratic Party over the issue of slavery is going to allow Lincoln to win, carrying only northern states. And he will win the office of the presidency in 1860, having only carried northern states because of the division among Democratic Party leaders. And while Lincoln lost the Senate seat, he's later going to become a presidential candidate because of his attack on the, quote, vast moral evil of slavery. This brought the issue of slavery to a political sphere. Then we have John Brown. We've already seen John Brown once in this chapter with his attack on Potawatomi, Kansas, the pro-slave town where he rode in with his followers and killed 5 men in the streets, cut their hands off and put them on spears in front of the town. The reason he did that was to provoke a confrontation, and it was effective. This time, he and his followers ride into Harper's Ferry, Virginia, in 1859 to seize a federal arsenal there. The plan was to get weapons and to hand them out to slaves on plantations, to spark a general slave uprising beginning in Virginia and carrying through the South. There are instances in history where this has been effective. The famous story of Spartacus, the gladiator, who led a slave uprising, who eventually almost toppled the Roman Empire at the height of its power. There's the story of Jamaica, where slaves rose up against their masters and became the independent island of Jamaica. There's the story of Haiti, where the same was done. There are stories of slave uprisings through history that have been effective. For example, the Helot uprising, which led to the collapse of the Spartans as a superpower in the ancient city-states of Greece. Again, slave uprisings have been effective. And John Brown saw a country where Roger Taney in the Supreme Court said that a slave was not a person. And he saw a government that was too afraid to do anything about the issue of slavery, which he, like Lincoln, felt was a vast moral evil. And he believed that it was his God-given duty to do something about it. Now, of course, what he did was illegal. And that's the question you're trying to answer. Does that make him a terrorist, though? And what we have to think about carefully was what Samuel Adams did illegal when he fought against the British regulars at Lexington and Concord? Was what Nat Turner did illegal when he started a slave uprising in Virginia? Certainly it was illegal. But the question around terrorism is, was it right what John Brown did? See, he went into the Harper's Ferry compound. He either killed or incapacitated the guards there. He attempted to hand out these weapons to slaves. Unfortunately, he was not able to complete his mission because the compound was raided by the U.S. Marines, led by Colonel Robert E. Lee, who put down the rebellion, killing all of Brown's followers, shooting and wounding John Brown, and dragging him out of the compound and arresting him and putting him on trial. Now, John Brown was hung the same year for the crime of high treason, the worst crime one can commit in our country. High treason means to raise arms against your country. And he was hung in December of that year. Northerners, meanwhile, applauded what John Brown had did, such as the Pennsylvania newspaper you read in your document analyzer, or the writings of Henry David Thoreau, who called John Brown a hero. Southerners, meanwhile, feared what he had done, as you saw in the Virginia newspaper, as you read in your document analyzer, calling him a traitor and going against the ways of the South. Here's a painting of John Brown on his way to his hanging. What you need to decide in your essay is, was that man a hero or was he a terrorist? It's a matter of perspective.
John Brown wants to light the fuse. October 1859. Passionate in his hatred of slavery, Brown prepares to take the fight into the heart of the South. His plan, to capture the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. The biggest collection of weapons in the South. 20,000 rifles, muskets, and pistols, worth almost $7 million today. He wants to arm Southern slaves and lead a slave rebellion. He's fighting alongside his 5 sons, all of them willing to die for their cause. The arsenal is poorly defended. Breaking in is a pushover. But his raid is based on local slaves rising up and joining the fight. He needs a small army to carry off so many weapons. Without slave reinforcements, it's a suicide mission. Word gets out, and local townsfolk attack the arsenal. Not a single slave joins Brown and his men. They are trapped and fighting for their lives.
I want to free all Negroes in the state. I have possession of the United States Armory. And if the citizens interfere with me, I must only burn the town and have blood.
Brother fights brother.
We fought and lost hundreds of thousands of men on both sides, fighting for what they believed was right.
In America's deadliest war.
Somebody gets tired, somebody blinks, somebody makes a mistake. That mistake, it's everything.
America, the story of us, continues next Sunday at 9 on History, made every day.
Radical abolitionist John Brown is trying to inspire a slave revolt. No slaves have joined him, and now he's trapped. At dawn, the U.S. Marines arrive. They storm the arsenal under the command of Colonel Robert E. Lee. Brown won't go down without a fight. But the soldiers overwhelm them. The fight against slavery has only just begun. But John Brown's crusade is over. His sons are dead. His trial captivates the country. Charged as a criminal, he puts the institution of slavery on trial. America is fatally divided. Brown is convicted of treason and sentenced to death. A terrorist in the South, a martyr in the North. He's executed on December 2nd, 1859. As the country prepares to elect a new president in 1860, many wonder if the nation can survive.
I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away, but with blood.
Meanwhile, the presidential convention in Chicago, at the Republican nomination for candidacy for president, was well attended, to say the least. Overflowing crowds came into Chicago at the Republican convention. In fact, Senator William Seward was expected to win the nomination. Lincoln was still a newcomer to the political sphere. He had lost the Senate seat. He had become outspoken on the issue of slavery. But in fact, he won the nomination because compared to William Seward, Lincoln was the more moderate of the two. Everyone knew how Lincoln personally felt about slavery. However, his position going into the election was that he would not seek laws immediately to end slavery. William Seward was ready to end slavery. In fact, he made that his platform. He said, if you elect me as your candidate for the Republican nomination for president in 1860, I'm going to do everything in my power to put an end to slavery. And so, think about the Republican convention that we just witnessed in 2016. The mess that was with 8 or 9 people screaming at each other throughout the debates. And then think about the ideals, the high-minded ideals that began the Republican Party over the issue of slavery. Where you have William Seward, who said, I will do everything in my power. And then you have Lincoln, who said, I believe this is evil, but I think it's going to take time. And so they actually elected Lincoln, who was going to be the more moderate of the two. Now, the election of 1860, the Democrats were split over the issue of slavery. Northern Democrats actually began to vote Republican in this issue. And yet Lincoln won the office of president in 1860 with less than half of the popular vote. Now, it's such an important election on the map here. You see, these states went for Lincoln, as well as Oregon and California. The South, meanwhile, was divided. And you can see on the popular vote here that Lincoln only won with 40% of the popular vote because it was split between Southern Democrat Breckinridge and Northern Democrat Douglas, and then a third party called the Constitutional Union, Bell, which carried several slave states. And so because of the division here in the Democratic Party, which really, if you think about it, had all of these votes went for the Northern Democrat Douglas or the Southern Democrat Breckinridge, either one of the two would have been president and the Civil War might have been put off. But because of the division about slavery, Lincoln carried the day and the Civil War will begin, and we'll talk about it in the next chapter.
Out of the 4 candidates that ran for president in the election of 1860, Abraham Lincoln of Illinois won the most votes. About a month after the election, fearing that Lincoln would bring about an end to slavery, South Carolina seceded, that is, broke away from the United States. At that time, President Buchanan was still in charge of the country, due to the fact that Lincoln's inauguration was still 10 weeks away. Buchanan didn't want to send troops to South Carolina and decided to wait to see what would happen next. In the meantime, another new state, Kansas, was admitted to the Union. Buchanan's decision not to use force in South Carolina proved to be a big mistake, because before Lincoln's inauguration in March of 1861, 6 other slave states, Texas, Florida, Louisiana, Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi, had seceded from the Union as well. They called themselves the Confederate States of America, and by the end of the year, the Confederates would be joined by North Carolina, Tennessee, Arkansas, and Virginia as well. A few days after South Carolina broke away from the Union, a small garrison of U.S. Army troops left Fort Moultrie, just outside of Charleston, and moved to Fort Sumter, a short distance away across the harbor. When South Carolina officials demanded that the U.S. troops leave Fort Sumter, they refused. In response, on April 12, 1861, Confederate troops opened fire on Fort Sumter as the citizens of Charleston watched on in horrified disbelief. And so began a 4-year Civil War that would bring about the deaths of 620,000 American soldiers.
In response to the election of 1860, South Carolina, as well as 6 other states, seceded. They wanted complete independence from federal control. They feared an end to their way of life because of the election of Abraham Lincoln, and they wanted to preserve the slave system. And so in February of 1861, the Confederate States of America formed, known as the Confederacy. The Confederacy, number one, agreed to permit slavery as well as recognize each state's sovereignty. So effectively, North Carolina became the nation of North Carolina in 1861. South Carolina became the nation of South Carolina briefly in 1861, and were allied in a confederacy in much the same way that the European Union is in a confederacy today. Former Senator Jefferson Davis was unanimously elected president by each of the individual states. Each state had to vote. They cast one vote. Each state voted for Jefferson Davis as president of the new Confederate States of America. One last example about how much of a joke James Buchanan was. When the South began to secede, James Buchanan said, "Wait a second, you can't do that." But, well, I can't do anything about it anyway. He called secession illegal, but he also said it was illegal to stop it. And meanwhile, great movie to watch about this time period is a movie called Gods and Generals. It does follow the case of several famous people in the American Civil War, but it also shows this weird gray period that we can now call the calm before the storm. People were resigning from their offices in D.C. and they were going down to Richmond, to the new Southern capital. Soldiers were resigning their post and re-enlisting as Confederate officers, and people were breaking up. Just as our country was experiencing disunion, families were breaking up. Friends were severing their ties. People were leaving their homes. This was as much a personal affair as it was a political one. Hearts were broken all across the country as brother left brother to go fight on opposite sides. I wanted to leave you with a quote. This is from one of the most famous Union generals in the war, one of the most bloodthirsty and brutal. We'll see he's responsible for the deaths of tens of thousands of men, women, and children. This man was a butcher, sanctioned by the Union, and we'll see why in a bit. But he said, and I quote, "This country will be drenched in blood. The people of the North are not going to let it be destroyed without a mighty effort to save it. Besides, where are your men and your appliances for war to contend against them? You are rushing into war against one of the most powerful, ingeniously mechanical, and determined people on earth, right before your doors. Only in spirit and determination are your people prepared. In all else, you are totally unprepared." And that was William Tecumseh Sherman, right before the war.